Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and joining us again is Professor Doug Cantrell, and he's going to talk to us about immigrants in Eastern Kentucky, a part of Eastern Kentucky's history that is sometimes left out. Well, let's switch topics here and let's talk about just immigration in Eastern Kentucky, something that people may or may not be as familiar with. I know it's surprising sometimes how many connections there are in Eastern Kentucky to immigrants and so forth. But let's start that. Let's start with that. Where do we start at with immigration in Eastern Kentucky?
Well, probably the best thing to start with is to look probably at just maybe a brief history of immigration into the United States. And most of the immigrants we're talking about who came into Eastern Kentucky are part of a period of immigration historians call the New Immigration, which was from about 1880 to about 1920. Now, there are several periods of immigration. The original settlers who came to 13 colonies, mainly from England, some other places, the Netherlands, Sweden, and then you have the the Scots-Irish immigrants coming in, around the time of the American Revolution and up until about 1810 or so. And then from about 1810 until about 1880, you have what's called the old immigration, which would be people from Northern and Western Europe, the English, Germans, Norwegian people. And then the pattern shifted about 1880 to Southern and Eastern Europe. And this is going to be the bulk of the immigrants who came to Kentucky, the so-called New Immigrants. And they came mainly for two reasons. The Industrial Revolution was taking place worldwide, not only in the United States, worldwide. And many of these people were being dislocated from rural agricultural lifestyles in Europe because of industrial development. And they had to go somewhere to find a job, and jobs were relatively plentiful in the United States. And then many of these immigrants were going to come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was mainly what's today Central Europe. And these people were coming to some degree because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was on the verge of breaking up. And there was a lot of political upheaval.
Unrest.
Some of these people came for that reason. And they are going to come to places like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, make their way to other cities, Chicago, Detroit, even out west to some extent. And these are the people then are going to eventually be employed in the coal industry. They first came to West Virginia and southwestern Virginia in the 1870s, mostly 1880s, 1890s. Then in the first decade, or toward the end of the first decade of the 20th century, they began to go into Eastern Kentucky. The first immigrants that I can document coming into Eastern Kentucky came into the Harlan County area around 1908 with the building of the Louisville-Nashville Railroad. And once the railroad was built, coal mining began to develop in Eastern Kentucky pretty extensively. And some of these immigrants who worked on the railroad decided to take jobs in coal mines. And so the first came there. And then you have coal mine operators needing labor because the population of Eastern Kentucky was pretty sparse at this time. Harlan County, for example, had about 10,000 people in it. There just wasn't enough people to work coal mines that developed, so you had to import a laborer from outside. And so coal mine owners turned to immigrants in overseas and immigrants in northeastern cities, in midwestern cities, and then they also turned toward African Americans in southern states like Alabama, Georgia, who were mainly tenant farmers. And really, you have, and this is a topic that would be nice for somebody to talk about and do some research on, is you have the first real migration of African Americans out of the South into places like West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, and Eastern Kentucky to mine coal. That's really a topic that's never been explored, as far as I know, or not extensively.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the immigrants, coal mine operators are going to recruit many of them. And now there are several things that these coal operators would use to recruit immigrants. One thing they would do is use a system that the Italians call the Padrone system. And this system made use of an intermediary, usually an immigrant from a certain ethnic group. If it was Italian, it'd be an Italian immigrant, or it was Hungarian, it'd be a Hungarian immigrant, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
These coal mine operators would contact this person and ask him to recruit a certain number of workers, and they would pay the Padrone by the head. If he could recruit 25 workers, they would pay him a certain fee for 25 workers. And so this immigrant who had been in the United States for probably a couple of decades or so, could speak English well, but also had connections in the ethnic community in northern cities and midwestern cities. And he would speak the native language, and he would take these newcomers and he would say, well, I've got a job for you. I can give you a job if you want a job. And so he would explain to them and say, I can get you a train ticket. I'll get you a place to live. If you want to go to Eastern Kentucky and mine coal. And so he would, if they agreed, they would sign a labor contract, be placed on a train usually the next day with a ticket, and sent to Eastern Kentucky, wherever the railroad ended in Harlan or Pikeville, or wherever it was at, to mine coal. And within probably 2 or 3 days after signing the contract, they were in the coal mines mining coal.
Now, what would the contract be? Like, what would it just work this amount of years?
Wages. You specify wages, it specify living conditions, housing conditions. Most of these workers were required by their labor contract to rent a house from the coal company. It would do things like specify they had to shop at the company store, a number of hours they would work a day, number of days they'd work a week. If they got any time off, which probably other than Sundays, or maybe Saturdays and Sundays, they didn't. Any holidays, although most of the time they didn't get holidays off. Any kind of fringe benefits, although really in those days there really weren't many fringe benefits to be had in labor contracts, but just mainly the working and living conditions. It's things like they could draw a script from the company store if they wanted an advance on wages, and most had to do this. The old song, "Oh my soul, the company store." That's many miners did that because of these loans. A script was a loan, advance on wages. Anyway, taken out of the pay envelope. You didn't get checks; you got paid in cash in an envelope usually once a month. And the mine operator would take whatever script you'd drawn out of your wages, along with deductions for the company doctor, which would be in a labor contract, and maybe to pay the school teachers would be in the labor contract. Those deductions were taken out of miners' pay. So it would specify just basically working and living conditions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that makes sense, and I didn't know if it was anything different or anything like that. But yeah. So once they got to where they were going, how did the cultures assimilate, or
Well, I guess, I don't know how, probably just naturally they would there were other immigrants around who spoke their language. Some had been in the United States longer and could speak both English and was somewhat familiar with American culture and American lifestyle, and they would help them assimilate. But they often lived in ethnic communities or ethnic, well, not communities, conclaves, I guess. You would have most of these immigrants were single males, and they would live in a boarding house operated by somebody from their own ethnic community. If you're Italian, it'd be an Italian boarding house, and this was an institution that developed within the immigrant community called the boarding ball system. As a few immigrants were married or had been in the United States long enough to have families or had brought families from Europe. And they would have generally a wife and children, and they would rent a house from the coal company, and they would then, to supplement their income, would take in boarders. And sometimes coal companies would build multi-room boarding houses and have an immigrant oversee that, hire somebody to oversee that boarding house, but usually just a house rented from the coal company, the company town. And they would place beds in usually every room of the house with the exception of the kitchen. And they would rent a bed to an immigrant who was of their own nationality. And this was done because they could speak the same language. And the wife and children of the immigrant who rented the house, who was called the boarding boss, would do the housework, cleaning, cooking, laundry, that sort of thing, mending clothing, excuse me, tending to maybe minor illnesses or cuts, bruises, that sort of thing, didn't need a doctor. And the head of the family, the miner who rented the house, was called the boarding boss. And it was sort of an attempt to create or recreate the extended family that most immigrants in European countries had known. Because in European countries, most people lived in extended families, and the head of the family was responsible for finding employment for and taking care of the junior members of the family. And so this was an attempt to some degree recreate that institution with modifications, of course. And so the boarding boss's word was law within the house, and most immigrants would live in this kind of situation, and they would assimilate in that way. And then they would assimilate too in the workplace, because they would work beside members of other ethnic groups. If you were Italian, you'd work with Hungarians, you'd work with Polish, you'd work with Russian. You would work with, American natives. You'd work with African Americans. And so assimilation occurred just simply by working. And then these company towns were generally small. Lynch was the largest company town. It had maybe a population of 10,000, and that was super large. Most of them had just a few hundred or maybe 1,000 or so. And so everybody knew everybody else. And so you would assimilate just by being around people, and you would learn the English language because that was spoken in the store and in the mine to a large extent, and the coal mine operators or mine owners and superintendents spoke English. And so you would just by simply being in the country learn English, and over time then you would give up some of your old world ways, and then you probably either bring your family over, because most women and children came to the United States and Eastern Kentucky because the husband sent for them, or a male miner may send for sisters, sort of thing. And so they would eventually have families. And the second generation, the children would generally have a foot in both worlds. They would be able to speak the native language. They would eat ethnic foods, dress in ethnic costumes at times, but then they would also speak English real well. They would eat American foods. They would begin to dress like, American style of dress, that sort of thing. And then the grandchildren, the third generation, would generally not be able to speak the native language. They spoke English only. They generally wouldn't eat much ethnic food. They would dress as in the American style, that sort of thing. So it took about 3 generations for assimilation to be complete. And then the 4th generation would generally try to go and rediscover their immigrant roots. But so the process would complete about 3 generations generally.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting too, to see how the generations kind of cling to the past and some let it go. Um, what like when we talk about Eastern Kentucky now, we don't talk about very many Central European immigrants. What drew those people out of Eastern Kentucky?
Well, mostly the Great Depression. Eastern Kentucky was a little different than other coal mining regions in that many of the mines in Eastern Kentucky were captive mines, which means that they were operated by larger corporations to supply factories that the corporation owned in other cities. Like U.S. Steel owned the mines at Lynch that supplied coal for U.S. Steel factories. Ford Motor Company owned mines at Wallens Creek in Harlan County, supplying coal for Ford Motor Company. And then International Harvester owned the mines at Benham in Harlan County, also supplying coal for International Harvester factories. And so as a result of that, when most immigrants began to leave in the 1920s in most states, because most Appalachian states, because the coal industry went into a depression shortly after World War I, about 1919, 20, 21. But the Eastern Kentucky coal industry didn't go into that kind of a depression until about 1929, the Great Depression, because of the captive mines. Those mines were still working because industry was booming, steel industry, the automobile industry, and farm implement industry booming in the 1920s still yet. And so Eastern Kentucky immigrants didn't leave until beginning about late 1920s, 1929, 1930, into the 1930s. But the price of coal simply fell because of the Great Depression below the cost of production. You could not, if you were a coal company, produce coal and sell it for what it cost you to produce it. And so when that happened, especially the smaller mines had to close. A few of the captive mines remained open, but they cut back on their labor force because automobile sales dropped. So Ford had to cut back. Farm equipment sales dropped. So International Harvester had to cut back. Steel sales dropped U.S. Steel had to cut back. So a lot of workers were laid off, and many of them were immigrants, and they had to go elsewhere to try to find jobs. So they went everywhere. Most of them probably went to northeastern cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, because they thought work was more plentiful there. Some of them migrate west, so they just scattered everywhere. But they're going to leave because of economic situation. Same factors that cause them to come to Eastern Kentucky are going to cause them to leave. And as I said, there's no more recruiting after the Great Depression hit. You don't have labor agents recruiting immigrants. You don't have the Padrone system being in use. You don't have immigrants who live in Eastern Kentucky sending for relatives who live in the old country or who live in northern cities, didn't make the trip with them. And you no longer have coal companies paying for immigrants to come into Eastern Kentucky. We talked about on transportation, in which coal companies would actually pay workers to come into the Eastern Kentucky, or at least make them think they're going to pay them. They actually made the workers pay the money back by holding train tickets out of the paycheck. But you don't have this going on after the Great Depression. Just no jobs anywhere to be had, and unemployment was somewhere between 25 and 35% in the 1930s. And so the coal industry was really, really, really affected badly. So most of these immigrants left in the 1930s, end of the 1920s and in the first half of the 1930s, because they couldn't make a living. Now some remained.
Yeah.
You have a number of people who remained their entire lives. A woman named Teresa Zotis in Martin County worked for the Martin County public school system as a librarian for several decades. You have Joe Scope in Harlan County, became a union organizer because the 1930s was the time of unionization in Eastern Kentucky and the coal mine wars in Harlan County. So he became a union organizer involved in that. You have some open businesses in Hazard. Jimmy Mongiardo opens a liquor store, and he then begins to, in the 1950s, he brings the first cable TV to Eastern Kentucky. And his son, Daniel Mongiardo, became a lieutenant governor and a doctor in Eastern Kentucky. You have one man named in Hazard, Victor Del Point, is an Italian immigrant who opened a dry cleaning store and run that until the 1970s, I guess. Some of them remain.
Yeah, you mentioned I guess that was be my question too, is what's the lasting impact? Um, as far as it still remains, besides those specific people.
Well, some of the businesses that they opened, you have the quarry industry and the stone cutting industry. Italian immigrants were, many of them had stone working skills. And so coal companies would hire these immigrants to build stone buildings and culverts and railroad bridges, that sort of thing. And these immigrants who had stone cutting skills would initially build buildings for coal companies, but then they saw there was a need for stone workers outside the coal companies, and some of them would quit the coal mine industry and open stone quarries and began to build buildings and produce gravel and stuff like that for use of native Appalachian people. And so most cut stone buildings that built in Eastern Kentucky were built by Italian immigrants. And you go into Lynch, Kentucky, and you see a lot of cut stone buildings there, even to this very day, that remain, and other coal camps. And you can almost bet those were built by Italian immigrants. The Catholic Church in Lynch is a cut stone building, a very beautiful, called Resurrection Parish, very beautiful, and it was built by Italian immigrants. Rumors are that immigrants in Lynch, to build that church, each immigrant family would contribute money to buy a stone, and it's a very beautiful structure. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. That's what I was told when I did some work there. But so you have the stone industry. You have then the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church practically didn't exist in Eastern Kentucky until immigrant workers began to bring the Catholic Church into Eastern Kentucky. So, and coal mine operators tended to view the church as a way to control, to some degree, or well, that's probably the wrong word, as to keep the labor force docile. Because one thing that coal mine owners did not want was unionization. And so there were tales of Catholic priests who would not let their parishioners have anything to do with the union. And so a lot of coal mine owners who were under the influence that the Catholic Church and its priests would tamp down unionization efforts. They often encouraged immigrants to establish Catholic churches and would help the bishop overseeing Kentucky build a church, and often donate land and sometimes donate money to build these churches in the coal camps, because they saw it as a way to keep unionization out. So the Catholic Church, that in most communities in Eastern Kentucky now have a Catholic population, and that population dates largely back to the days of the immigration. Other churches, you have Greek Orthodox, you have a few Jewish synagogues. Most of those didn't survive because the number of immigrants who were Eastern Orthodox or Jewish were very small, but most were Catholic, and the Catholic Church survived and exists today. So that's a legacy. Then you have at least one immigrant who's written a book, Steve Kellerman, who was an offspring of immigrants, immigrant child in Harlan County, wrote a book about Eastern Kentucky back, I guess, the 1970s or so. There's somewhat of a legacy there.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds like a pretty good book to check out as well. I'll have to get that information down.
I think it was a thesis at the University of Kentucky, I believe, on maybe the development of mining in Harlan County. I can't remember now. I read it 40 years ago.
Yeah. Now you said is the palindrome, is that what, that's
Yeah,
the
Padrone,
in between?
Padrone. Yeah,
Okay.
Padrone.
Now that became illegal, right?
Yeah, it became illegal. Uh, well, Congress passed a bill into law that forbade immigrants from uh, forbade companies from importing immigrant workers from overseas. And so the Padrone system didn't become illegal, but the importation of workers did. And that's one reason the Padrone system developed, because it became illegal to recruit, for companies to recruit immigrants overseas. And before that law was passed, the a lot of companies now that law was passed long before coal mine development in Eastern Kentucky was passed. I think sometime probably the 1880s or so. But before that law passed, it was common for companies to contract with steamship companies that carried passengers from European nations to the United States, and they would send these steamship companies tickets for immigrant workers who wanted to go to the coal mines or other factories in northeastern Midwestern cities. And so a lot of immigrants came because they were recruited by steamship companies before the 1890s or so. But then when that became illegal, then you had the Padrone system developing, which was another method that companies could use to get around the legality of importing workers. They would have they would hire them from workers that were mainly already here in American cities. Now, companies still imported workers from directly overseas because if you had, say, an Italian or Hungarian or Russian or Polish person working at your coal mine, and that person had, say, a brother or a cousin or some other family member who wanted to work and he wanted to come to the United States, he would go to the coal mine owner or the superintendent and say, "Look, I've got this relative in Hungary or Austria or Czechoslovakia or Romania or wherever it might be, that he wants to come to the United States and he's a good worker. Uh, can you give him a job?" And
Yeah.
well, coal mine owners really needed a lot of workers, and there was always a shortage, at least when the industry first developed, of workers. And so they were willing to say, "Yeah, we'll advance you the money to send a steamship ticket to your cousin." So they would give this worker money to purchase a steamship ticket for his cousin or brother or whoever it might be, and that person would receive a steamship ticket, and then once he was in New York City or wherever he came to, he would be given a train ticket to meet his relative. But it would all sort of under the table would be handled by the relative, but the money was
Yeah.
coming from the coal company, so it was recruiting in a way. But the
Mhm.
immigrant kind of recruited workers for the coal company, so that was a way of getting around the declaration of importing workers to be illegal.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it still happened to some degree. But the Padrone system was another way that coal operators recruit workers. And another way around the illegality of importing workers is that coal mine operators sometimes themselves would make use of labor agents. They would go into cities themselves and hire somebody who was from the immigrant community who spoke the language, and they would go to a saloon and they would he would tell the immigrant that, "Look, I've got to tell your compatriots that I've got a good job for them, and I'll give them a transportation to the coal mine and see how many you can recruit." And so he would pay this immigrant to do that. He would go with him and talk, and the immigrant would translate into whatever language they spoke what the coal mine owner said. That was a way. Coal mine owners also used labor agencies that began to develop to recruit. But they would also place advertisements in the foreign language press. Almost every ethnic group in the
Oh,
United
wow.
States had newspapers printed in their language. And we talked about when Himmler, the newspaper he published, Magyar Bandislap, which was Hungarian. They would advertise in that newspaper or other newspapers, and convince immigrants who read those newspapers in their language to come. There was a good job here for you, and we'll give you transportation, and you just contact supervisor at this mine, and you'll get a job. And so a lot of
Mhm.
immigrants came into Eastern Kentucky for that reason too, or just simply being you know, reading these advertisements and
Hmm.
taking
Yeah.
advantage of employment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it all makes sense. And, I could see that. I mean, it happens today too.
Yeah,
Somebody
yeah,
has a
it's
relative that can, hey, come hire this person and so forth as well. Um,
well, immigrants would do the, you have a lot of, my understanding now, there's certain professions that, most workers are immigrants today, like roofing and landscaping. Uh,
mhm.
Same thing in those days. You have jobs that there were not enough Americans to fill, or uh, and so immigrants were willing to fill those jobs. They needed the work, and they were willing to do those jobs. Coal mine was one of them. You just couldn't get enough workers in coal mines.
Yeah. Yeah. We
Uh,
want to thank Professor Cantrell again for joining us and talking to us about immigrants in Eastern Kentucky, and sharing all his knowledge. Again, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.